Lijepo vas pozdravljam i dobrodošli u novu emisiju Globezoom Nikole Kneza. Danas vam predstavljam povjesničara i člana Kraljevskog književnog društva, pa čak i englesko-ruskog grofa Nikolaja Tolstoja. Grof Tolstoj je posvetio pola svoga života na istraživanje tragične sudbine Kozaka koji su nakon završetka Drugog svjetskog rata bili izručeni Rusima. Za nas Hrvate njegovo istraživanje zanimljivo jer se sudbina hrvatske vojske i civila nakon Drugog svjetskog rata poistovjećuje sa Kozacima. Naime, i jedni i drugi imali su garancije Engleza da će biti prihvaćeni i proslijeđeni do sigurnih američkih zona u Italiji. Umjesto toga, na prijevaru su izručeni jugoslavenskim i ruskim komunistima koji su ih masovno likvidirali. U našem slučaju radi se o najvećoj tragediji hrvatskog naroda, poznatoj kao Bleiburška tragedija i križni put. Grof Tolstoj je objavio mnoga literarna djela. Za nas pak najznačajnije je The Ministers and Massacres. Po objavi njegove knjige tužen je sudu jer je engleskog premijera Harolda Macmillana poentirao kao primarnog krivca za izručenje desetaka tisuća ljudi. Iako su svi arhivski dokazi govorili o njegovu korist, sud je odrezao kaznu od 1,5 milijuna funti zbog uznemiravanja službene osobe njezina kraljevstva. Grof Tolstoj i njegov rad je živi primjer kako se istina dijela povijesti još uvijek pomno skriva, jer govori o masovnim zločinima nevinih ljudi, o tajnim suradnjama dviju javno suprotstavljenih ideologija, kapitalizma i komunizma. Stoga, drago mi je pozdraviti ovog hrabrog čovjeka i grofa istine. Poštovani grofe Tolstoj, vjerujem da bi za naše gledalce bilo zanimljivo znati da li ste vi u rodu sa poznatim ruskim piscem Tolstojem.
Yes, I am. In fact, I'm not a direct descendant, but I'm the head of the senior line of Tolstoy family, and so now I am actually the head of the family. As head of the family, I have a wonderful cross, the cross of Saint Spiridon, who's the patron saint of our family, which I think was given to my ancestor in 1430, and we still have it.
Recite mi, molim vas, kada je vaša obitelj došla u Englesku?
My father, Dmitri, was born in 1912, and we lived at the city, outside the city of Kazan. But when the Reds finally, in the spring of 1920, were preparing to, in 1918, were preparing to seize the city, and Trotsky gave orders for all members of the nobility to be massacred. We were told that we had to flee and join the whites. But suddenly my father was told by the doctor, he had very bad illness, I forget what, and he couldn't be moved. So the men of the family, my grandfather and the others, they went off to join Admiral Kolchak's forces. And my father was looked after by his aunt and his English nanny, who they were both very brave, and they kept him hiding in the city for 2 years. And finally, he was escaped from the Soviet Union in 1920. He was smuggled out by his nanny. She pretended he was her illegitimate son and smuggled him out through Finland. And so we came to England. And I was born in England 15 years later.
Možete li za naše gledatelje opisati kad ste i zašto počeli istraživati sudbinu Kozaka nakon Drugog svjetskog rata?
Well, I was always very interested in the Cossacks and in Russian history, though sometimes English people say, oh, well, you must be biased in favor of the Cossacks because of your ancestry. Well, actually, the Nikolai that I'm named after was killed by the Cossack leader Pugachev in Catherine the Great's reign. So I don't have any special reason to be biased in their favor. But my interest developed at an early age. And I think the first time I heard of the sinister history of the repatriation in 1945 was in 1956, when as a young man, I heard that Bulganin and Khrushchev were making a state visit to London, the first visit by Soviet leaders. And I was so angry, I went with a big placard, which I held up, saying, "Keep the red beasts out." And I was immediately arrested and put into a police cell. And there, a nice police sergeant came to give me some supper. And he asked me why I felt so strongly. And I said, well, I mentioned the repatriation, which I must have heard of. And he said, oh, that's funny, because I was in the British Army in Austria in 1945, and we had to send the Russians back, and we thought they would be happy to go. And he said, but they were committing suicide, and I realized there was something wrong. And this stuck in my mind. But it wasn't until the British government started in, I think, about 1973, releasing documents from up to the end of the war. And a Ukrainian friend of mine looked into it briefly, and he said, you should look at these. They're now releasing the state paper. I did go and look, and even though what I saw then was tiny compared with what I know now, nevertheless, I saw that this was a terrible. I didn't know the numbers, that something like 2.25 million people were handed over, which is roughly the same statistic for the Atlantic slave trade during 3 centuries. And this is the British and the Americans handed over these slaves. And so I thought, well, nobody else seems to be writing the story, and I shall write it. So I did, but it took me 4 or 5 years of research. But the great advantage of doing the research then was that I was able to interview so many people of all nationalities who were involved. And that gave me a much more vivid and direct picture. But of course, also I relied on the British state papers which were released.
U vrijeme kad je vaša knjiga izašla van, izazvala je veliku pozornost i čuđenje, posebice zbog uloge engleskih snaga u cijeloj priči. Taj je dio izrodio i kontroverze. Možete li nam reći o čemu se radilo i kako je knjiga primljena u Engleskoj u kojoj živite?
Yes, I wrote this second book after my Victims of Yalta because so much new information had come to light. And the other very important factor was that I had not realized that the Serbs and Slovenes and Croats were being handed, well, I knew they were being handed over, but it occurred to me that this was also a secret of World War II, and that maybe if I learned more about that, then I would learn more about the Cossacks. But before long, I realized both stories are equally important. So half the book is about the Croats and Slovenes, and the other half about the Cossacks. And I pointed to Harold Macmillan, who at the time was the British minister in the Mediterranean, the political advisor to Field Marshal Alexander. And there, I couldn't go into all the evidence here in this interview, but the documentary evidence is overwhelming that Macmillan secretly gave the order, first of all, to hand over the Cossacks by force, if necessary, and secondly, and even more sinister, to hand over thousands of people who were not Soviet citizens. And the Yalta Agreement, which the British government still says, oh, well, they were just obeying the Yalta Agreement. Well, that's just not true. The Yalta Agreement very carefully says only Soviet citizens should be returned. So this made me realize that there was a conspiracy within a conspiracy. And now I've finished another book, but perhaps we'll come to it.
Znači, istraživajući sudbinu Kozaka, otkrili ste podatke da su Englezi isto tako izručili Titovim partizanima Hrvate i Slovence.
Yes, I realized that this was a story that hadn't been told, the Yugoslav side of things, not hardly at all. And so I investigated both. And again, I was lucky to interview a number of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes who were victims of these awful occasions. And the book came out in, I think, 1986. And in 1990, the moment Slovenia broke away from Yugoslav dictatorship, I came to, for the first time, to Slovenia. And there I was taken secretly to the place in Kočevski Rog, where thousands of people were murdered, and the bones were still there, of course. That I think about, from memory, 50,000 people were handed over by the British to be murdered by Tito. Yeah. And no British government has ever expressed regret for this.
Da li je Macmillan odluku o izručenju donio sam ili u koncertu sa Churchillom?
I think I show in my book that Churchill did not know and was deceived by Macmillan, who didn't tell him what was happening. And indeed, as I say in my recent book, that all the military men involved said it was a political decision, and the only politician involved was Macmillan, who flew into Austria on the 13th of May, 1945, and there gave the order that these people were all to be handed over by force, if necessary. And as far as the Cossacks were concerned, he specifically says Cossacks and White Russians. And this was never authorized and was kept secret from Churchill and secret from Field Marshal Alexander, the commander, too. So it's still a mystery, but you mentioned what was Macmillan's motive. Well, there's no question in my mind, and I think anyone who sees the new evidence will, I think, agree. There's no question that he was secretly given an order by Churchill. On the contrary, Churchill, but this is one of the new major factors which has come out in my new book, is that arrangements were made by Churchill, arranged with Eisenhower for the Cossacks to be evacuated from Austria into the American zone and should not be handed over to the Soviets. So there was actually an alternative. People at the moment don't realize that, but that is the fact.
Čitajući vašu knjigu, našao sam zanimljiv podatak o kretanju Macmillana na samom završetku rata, odnosno u svibnju 1945. godine. Letio je iz Londona do Fieldmaršala Aleksandra u Italiju, potom na Bleiburg u Austriju, iza toga u Rim. Da li znate sa kim je imao sastanak u Rimu i o čemu se razgovaralo?
I never found any, but I think he met the Pope. Yes, he met the Pope, but I don't think anything particularly significant happened there. I would say more significant was his relationship with the Soviet delegation at Allied headquarters in Naples. And they were, of course, they were not diplomats. They called themselves diplomats. They were members of Smersh. And their principal job was to ensure the handover of every Russian living who'd escaped into Western Europe, one way or another. And I suppose if I guess, I mean, this is a guess, but I think you have to, as Sherlock Holmes said, when you've eliminated the alternatives, then you're left with the truth. Well, the alternatives are not very great. Yeah. There was no pragmatic reason for doing it. We didn't gain anything from it. So there was some other reason. But as I say in my new book, if those were good reasons, why didn't Macmillan himself advance them? He was alive when my 2 books came out, but he wouldn't say anything. And he knew that sooner or later, if he told a lie, he would be caught out. So he said nothing.
Vi ste imali pristup engleskim vojnim arhivima pri istraživanju podataka za svoju knjigu. U jednom se trenutku odlučilo taj arhiv zatvoriti. Kako je to utjecalo na vaš istraživački rad?
I don't think there's been any general closing of archives, but specifically, yes, what you said is correct, because after my book came out, I was then sued for libel by the British Chief of Staff in Austria, who signed the orders. And I said he was no different from a Nazi war criminal, and I certainly would still say that. And he then was compelled to sue me for libel. And immediately the whole British establishment dirty tricks brigade went to work. And among their dirty tricks was that they removed all compromising documents from the Public Record Office, where people like myself can consult them, and removed them and hid them back at the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defense for the whole duration of the trial. And how we found out about this, well, first of all, when I wanted a record, I was told, no, the Foreign Office has it. We could do nothing about it. And so most of the defense case became impossible as a result. And it's ironical that when eventually in 1992, I went to Russia, as I'll explain later, to look at the Russian archives. They were far more open than the British, far more.
To je jako zanimljiv podatak. Pokušavam razumjeti kako mi u Hrvatskoj još uvijek nemamo otvoreni ulaz u arhivu iz vremena komunističke diktature jugoslavenskog režima.
Because after all, Croatia, not that I'm much admiration for the European Union, but it claims to be an open democratic society, and that they can conceal historical evidence like this is the first mark of a totalitarian government. They have to control the past in order to control the present.
Znači, skrivanje dokumenata, a time istine, postaje jedna od glavnih poluga njihove moći.
Well, of course, it speaks for itself. They wouldn't hide the documents if they didn't show Tito's regime in a very sinister light. In the same way, why did they hide the documents that I wished to see? Because it showed that what I'd written was fundamentally correct. And indeed, the documents they hid would have greatly strengthened my argument. I don't say that through guesswork, because subsequently I was able to get copies after all, when it was too late for the trial. So I think all one can do is continue to press to make sure that the rest of the world knows about this. And sooner or later, I mean, I never dreamt before 1990 that one day I would be invited by President Yeltsin to come to Russia and see all the secret archives. So if it can happen there, I think it can also happen in Zagreb. We hope. Of course, in their guilt, they may destroy the documents, but that in itself will be an admission of guilt.
Arhiva komunističke Jugoslavije je uglavnom u Srbiji i nama je nemoguće do nje doći, što znači od Hrvata se skriva povijest jugoslavenskog režima. Što mislite, da li bi Englezi mogli stisnuti Srbe da ovi vrate našu arhivu?
Maybe if one day we have a civilized government in Belgrade, then we will see the archives, we hope. They can't destroy everything, as I found, because after all, in my case, it was a miracle to me that I found the other half of the documents in Moscow. And of course, the British government couldn't get access to that.
donio odluku o osudi svih zločinačkih režima u koji je konačno uključio i komunizam. Što mislite, može li ta odluka potaknuti vlade država, organizacije za ljudska prava, akademiju i pojedince u većoj angažiranosti oko istraživanja komunističkih zločina?
Well, everything in that recognizing these obvious facts is for the good, of course. But nevertheless, the sad thing is that here in Britain, and from what you say also in Croatia, that they don't really equate them at all. For instance, our Prime Minister went to commemorate the liberation of Belsen. Well, it was a very good thing that we did so, but we were actually, we hadn't murdered anyone in Belsen. It was the Nazis who did that. But there was no apology for sending back in our Britain's case, well over 1 million people to be sent to the Gulag or machine gunned on arrival. And there's so the official position in Britain is tacitly that communism is nothing like as bad. But as you say, anyone who's familiar with the facts knows that there's, particularly between Nazism and communism, very little difference.
Josip Broz Tito, Staljinov adjutant, je zauzeo 10. mjesto na rang listi svjetskih masovnih ubojica svih vremena. Što mislite o Titu?
Well, I think Tito, of course, had worked in the Comintern for Stalin, and he had been trained up by Stalin, and practically all his comrades were betrayed by him in Moscow and liquidated. And Tito survived as Stalin's pupil, and he realized, and I wouldn't be surprised if he hadn't received direct advice, just the only safe way with your enemies is to kill them all. And if you kill too many, well, that's better than killing too few. So they go for these huge figures. Of course, it doesn't necessarily work in the long run, because these horrific figures are part of what impresses itself on public consciousness. I mean, like when Jewish people commemorate the 7 million Jews who were slaughtered, the figure, in one sense, it shouldn't be important. If one Jew was murdered, that's an atrocious crime. But actually, you're multiplying the crime by 111 until you get to 7 million, or in case 750,000 in Croatia. In Russia, we still don't know, but far more than were killed by Hitler. And in China, even worse. All these communist or socialist, rather, totalitarian regimes have far more in common than they have different. Doesn't stop them quarreling with each other, because just as the mafia falls out with its own people.
Krenemo li od Europe, uključivo Njemačke, Jugoslavije, Rusije pa sve do Kine, uglavnom su najveći masovni zločini počinjeni od strane socijalista i komunista. Da li je uopće moguće takve masovne likvidacije ljudi napraviti bez unaprijed pripremljenog i razrađenog plana? Znam da bi moje pitanje moglo otvoriti Pandorinu kutiju, no zanima me što vi mislite. Postoji li neki globalni zločinački mastermind koji planira sve te zločine i zločince?
Well, I think the mindset of the dictators, of course, is that they just have one thing, that a dead enemy is better than a live one, and they've no religion, of course. They're all atheist regimes, so they have no conscience, and they have this crude Marxism, which provides their equivalent of a spiritual justification. But in fact, all it does is justify any crime of any sort. But I think psychologically, people do need a justification, and even the worst criminals, if you talk to them, well, I can't say I've talked to many, but they have evolved a sort of justification that they were badly treated in their childhood, or the police were corrupt, or this sort of thing. And I remember when I went to Belgrade in 1990, yes. I interviewed, I've forgotten his name momentarily, the awful man who was Tito's chief henchman in arranging the killings in Slovenia. And I interviewed him, and to my embarrassment, some nice Serbian journalists had arranged for me to meet him. We were in the open in a cafe, it was summer, and he embraced me, and he said, "I'm now given up communism and I've become Russian Orthodox Christian. And I thought, some Christian. But of course, fundamentally, all he needed was something to justify his crimes. And Stalin, Hitler, and I think Mussolini was not a good man, but he was on a slightly different range, I think. I think fascism is, in some respects, distinct. The similarities are great, but also there are distinctions, as Hitler himself recognized. And it's interesting that I think I'm right, that I read somewhere that when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, up to the National Socialism was the respectable name that the Nazis gave themselves, and Stalin gave the order, they will now be known as German fascists. But they were never called that before. And now you hear even people in the West have now swallowed Stalin's propaganda without even knowing they're doing it, because it was not Nazism. Nazism was not really fascist. It was socialist. It wanted rule from above, people who know what's best for the population. The population can have no say in what happens. You have a small party of the elite, which in fact is completely subservient to the dictator. And of course, today, the biggest nation on earth is ruled by just such a genocidal, sinister regime. So unfortunately, the evil has not been rooted out, and it will only be rooted out, well, in different ways, but by being strong, but also by making people aware of the truth of the nature of these regimes.
Prema ovome što kažete, pretpostavljam da ste se sastali sa komunističkim zločincem Srbinom Simom Dubajčem, Titovim partizanom. Prema našim podacima, on je osobno ubio vlastitim rukama preko 2000 Hrvata. Što mislite o njemu?
Well, I would say he was a low criminal type to me. He was extremely friendly to me, a little bit too friendly, I thought. And but he did say something. He said to me, I got a tape-recorded interview. He said, "You must understand, I was a communist in those days, and if Tito had told me to murder my grandmother, I would have done it willingly." So that tells me everything about communism. The people who now justify or in any way assist the propagation of the idea that communist rule was not bloodstained up to the elbows, they are, in one respect, are worse, because they don't have to accept. Dubaj was a fairly uneducated man operating in a totalitarian system. These people are free. They don't have to express these opinions, yet they choose to do so. So in that major respect, I find them more evil even than someone like Dubaj. But yes, he was an evil man, but yeah. I think every criminal totalitarian society will find these semi-criminal elements and make good use of them.
I uza sve navedeno, vlade Hrvatske, Bosne i Hercegovine te Srbije još uvijek zataškavaju i sakrivaju komunističke zločine i zločince koji su ih naredili, odnosno izvršili. Što mislite zašto?
Yes, it's shocking to me, really shocking. After all, in some respects, the truth is more evident in former Yugoslavia, because you can actually see these mass graves, which so far we've not been able to see inside the Soviet Union. Whereas there people can see with their own eyes. So I think they deceive themselves, but mostly they're, I guess, opportunists, people with obviously by definition with no principles at all. And but they hang on to power because it's what they love. And then they also, in all these regimes, not enough, I think, is made of the material advantages of holding this position of power, which they deny to others. I mean, Tito lived, he had palaces all over Yugoslavia. He had his mistresses. Stalin he could draw any amount of money he liked out of any bank in the whole of Russia. He lived in incredible style. Even Lenin, whom there supposedly was more puritanical, he wasn't at all. He was at the height of the initial famine in the early 20s. He stopped some grain deliveries so that several Rolls Royces could be delivered from England for his personal use. So I think one shouldn't overlook what is probably the strongest element, which is this criminal mentality. As criminals, they've no shame in lying.
Recite nam nešto više o svojoj novoj knjizi.
There will be big pressure in England not to publish, I know that. But to me, it's a very exciting book because I've now, for the first time, I've got all these records from the Soviet archives. And in my previous book, I think in The Victims of Yalta, I wrote at one point, of course, I have to confess that there I've done as much research as I can. One half of the information is not unknown to me, and that's in the Soviet archives, and perhaps it will never be known to me. But now it is known to me, and I have the copies of the archives, and they're absolutely devastating for the British official position. And they show without question the conspiratorial nature of what happened. At every detail is now vouched for in the Soviet archives. And I've been told, but I don't know if that's true, that these archives have been closed since I went, which was, after all, nearly 20 years ago. I don't know if that's true, and it may not be. But nevertheless, of course, I take very good care that I have many copies in many places. But I'm much more afraid of the British government than the Soviet government for interference.
Baš ste me iznenadili ovom izjavom. Zašto tako mislite?
Well, the British are sly. They will, the government, I mean the British people, but the British government. And you'd think that today, none of them obviously had any direct concern with what happened in 1945. Many of them weren't even born. But nevertheless, they feel that what I write threatens their position. But they must feel very vulnerable, because a sensible, humane person is prepared to accept things, but they can't accept it. They feel their privileged position is, to some extent, involves a ridiculous feeling you have got to be seen to be perfect. But we're none of us perfect.
Hoće li u vašoj novoj knjizi biti riječi i o Hrvatima i njihovoj sudbini križnog puta pod jugoslavenskim komunističkim režimom?
I can't say that I've discovered such extraordinary new evidence in the case of the Croatians. I have got material evidence which I refer to. For instance, I was able to not only to interview Simo Dubajic, but also Dr. Franz Kochevar, who was the Yugoslav communist colonel who actually made the secret deal with British Brigadier Lowe, the one who took the legal action against me. And I have about 2 hours of him telling me exactly what happened at this meeting and what was going on there. So there are still things I hope to publish.
Vjerujem da ste čuli o odluci Austrijskog parlamenta kojom žele zabraniti održavanje Blajburške komemoracije. Kako bi čovjek mogao opisati tu nemoralnu i primitivnu odluku koja je protiv svih pozitivnih normi civiliziranog zapadnog svijeta?
I myself experienced this, and I forget, in the 1980s, when I went I went several years to the Bleiburg to the commemorations in May, and on one occasion I was there, and afterwards there was a British reporter from the Times who wanted to interview me, and we went to his hotel, and the police came in and said, "You're not allowed to hold this interview." And the writer from the Times was amazed. He said, "But I thought this was a democracy." And the policeman said, "No, you can't report this." So it's not very different now from what I hear. And I don't know why, but now I'm mystified. Then, of course, the Austrians are probably a little bit frightened of Tito. There were still tank blocks and so on along the frontier, barbed wire. But now they're not going to be invaded by anyone. So I can't understand what's made them behave in such a despicable way, which it is. And after all, most of the people at Bleiburg were murdered once they'd crossed back into Yugoslavia, but many were killed on the spot. And these crimes should not be whitewashed out. If they were doing it, if it was about crimes committed by Nazis in Austria against Jews, of course they wouldn't dare to ban the meeting. But what's the difference? They're all human beings.
Poštovani grofe Tolstoj, hvala vam najljepše na vašim zanimljivim mislima koje ste podijelili sa nama.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Dragi gledalci, posjetite web stranicu Hrvatskog finskog instituta na kojoj možete vidjeti par odličnih filmova, pročitati osvrte autora, odnosno i akademske radove relevantne po temama za našu hrvatsku povijest, kulturu i naciju.